The year that Henry VIII became King of England, Don Diego Columbus went to the New World to be governor of Hispaniola. He did not, however, have the title of viceroy. After his father's death, Diego had carried the fight for this title, originally promised to the Columbus family forever, into the law court, but with no success. Fortunately, he had fallen in love with Doña Maria Alvarez de Toledo, a distant relative of the king, and after their marriage he had been given the post as governor. Governor Columbus and his bride sailed for Santo Domingo with a very splendid retinue of knights and ladies, so far the most magnificent expedition to leave Spain for the New World. Bartholomew and Diego Columbus, the governor's two uncles, were in the company, also his brother Ferdinand, who was then 21. Ferdinand had been appointed to take charge of building monasteries and churches on the island. But he was not happy there. The things in which he was interested were not to be found in the wilderness. After a few months he got permission to return to Spain. There he began collecting his famous library with the purchase of his first book, a new edition of the Travels of Marco Polo. In Santo Domingo, Governor Diego Columbus began to build for himself a magnificent palace at Alcazar, with walls of stone 2 feet thick and woodwork of the finest mahogany. The original walls are still there, and also there to be seen is the cathedral which he built, now the oldest one in the Western Hemisphere. At first the governor and his court were located at Concepcion de Vega, which was inland about 100 miles from Santo Domingo. There, one Saturday in November 1510, a dusty, footsore friar came to pay his respects to the governor. He said that he and 2 other Dominican friars had come to Hispaniola to work among the Tainos. On Sunday, he preached to the Spaniards, describing the glories of heaven, and asked them to send their Tainos for instruction in the afternoon. Large numbers came and formed a circle around the young missionary, who sat on a stool, a crucifix in his hand, and spoke to them through an interpreter. These Tainos were the miserable victims of a cruel system of enforced labor. A certain number of Tainos were parceled out to each Spaniard to work for him in the gold mines or on his plantation. When they died of overwork, starvation, or abuse, the Spaniard was simply given more to replace them. The average Spaniard treated the Tainos less well than their dogs, some actually feeding them to the dogs when they ran short of meat. Of the peaceful, friendly Tainos who had welcomed Columbus, so many of them had been exterminated that more were being forcibly removed from the Bahamas to take their place. In a few years these would also die, and be replaced by slaves from Africa. One of the most tragic legacies of the colonization of the Americas was the genocide of the Tainos and the enslavement of over 12 million Africans. The 3 Dominicans were shocked and horrified by the hideous cruelty practiced by the Spaniards. They decided that one of them must preach to their countrymen on the sin of what they were doing. The church was full. Governor Diego Columbus, his wife Maria, and the officers of the crown were all in their pews as Father Montesino spoke his opening words. "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness," he said, "and it will prove to be for you the strongest, harshest, most frightful voice you have ever listened to. The voice tells you that all of you are now living and dying in a state of mortal sin on account of your cruelty and tyranny over these innocent people. Have you lost your reason? Have you lost your senses? Continue as you are doing, and you will have lost your souls." This was the main point of his sermon. That afternoon there was a meeting of outraged Spaniards in the governor's house. Speaking for the committee, the governor then delivered an ultimatum to the friar that unless he retracted what he said, steps would be taken to bring him to his senses. Unlike most of those Spanish settlers who resented the sermon, one of them was so moved by the voice crying in the wilderness that it changed his entire life. His name was Las Casas, Bartholomew de las Casas. He had been living on a plantation in Haiti for about 7 years, but had been born in Seville. He was about 18 and remembered very well when Christopher Columbus returned in 1493 from his great voyage of discovery, bringing 7 Tainos, the first ever seen in Europe. On the second voyage, his father had gone with Columbus and returned with enough gold to send his son to study law at the University at Salamanca. Bartholomew had also been given an enslaved Taino, one Columbus had given his father, but who had to be sent back on the next ship. Queen Isabella was very angry that the admiral should presume to give her vassals away, and issued a decree that whoever had received a Taino must, under pain of death, send him back on the next ship sailing for Hispaniola. The next ship at that time was the one on which Bobadilla was being sent out as a judge. Las Casas' father went with him. Santo Domingo was then but a few thatched huts around the fort, and there were no more than 300 settlers on the island. Gold, however, was beginning to be mined in such great quantities that in 1502, when Ovando was sent out as a governor, 2,500 men were eager to go with him. One of these was young Las Casas, who had obtained his degree of law from the university and was setting out to seek his fortune. Las Casas had accepted conditions as he found them in the wilderness with little thought, until he heard the sermon. All the evils he had observed but ignored, he then saw with new eyes. He walked from the church a changed man. Without hesitation, he made up his mind to become a priest and to devote his life to the welfare of the natives. Before the end of the year 1510, he had been consecrated and said his first Mass, the first Mass ever celebrated in the New World. For that reason, he said, it was made the occasion of prolonged festivities by the Governor Columbus and all those in the city. It was smelting time, and great crowds came with their natives and their gold as they do in Spain on a great market day or fair. It was no easy task that Las Casas had taken upon himself to protect the natives, to see that they were treated with Christian love and justice. He roused the antagonism of all Spanish settlers who benefited from the awful system, and he had a powerful enemy in Spain working against him, a member of the king's privy council in charge of native affairs. This was Bishop Fonseca, an absentee landlord who himself had 1,200 natives working for him in gold mines and on his plantation. He had no intention of having that income diminished. Las Casas let no man discourage him. Unwilling to admit that his cause was hopeless, he went back and forth across the sea, tireless in his fight for compassion and justice.